jousting contests, human chess matches, lords and ladies and beggars. A traveling Renaissance fair has come to Sunnydale. The fair may seem terminally uncool, but Buffy and her friends are charmed anyway, especially by a sad-eyed boy named Roland, who serves as the court jester. Unfortunately, the people from the fair are not the only visitors in Sunnydale. Roaming the countryside are nasty little creatures with a taste for flesh, the Dark Fairy. They are minions of the Wild Hunt, servants of the evil Errol King. Buffy's challenge is to annihilate the king and his murderous horde, but the path to his destruction leads straight to Roland, who is not quite human, and destined to become the Slayer's mortal adversary. No he isn't. You were so close this time. Missed it by that much.
My son, thou hidest thy face as in fear. The Earl King Father, see, he is near. With crown and scepter and snow-white shroud. My son, 'tis but a passing cloud.
Child of the Hunt by Christopher Golden and Nancy Holder is the fifth Buffy the Vampire Slayer tie-in novel. After taking on a season arc book in Blooded, Golden and Holder are back to doing a single episode style adventure like Halloween Reign. However, this time they're going for an issues narrative, continuing the theme of teenage runaways and their relationships with their parents, seen in Season 3 Episode 1 Anne, and Season 3 Episode 2 Dead Man's Party. Blooded was set in a speculative Season 3, but Child of the Hunt is set in the actual season, and it surprisingly effectively captures the tone of it. Golden and Holder must have been briefed on what the season would cover, and maybe shown Anne and Dead Man's Party, or at least their scripts, and they must have realized that they misjudged Buffy as mostly campy with some drama, instead of mostly dramatic with some campiness and rapidly course-corrected after Blooded. The two books were released within a month of each other, and represent a jarring tonal shift from cartoony playfulness to brooding melodrama. It's like Blooded is the first act of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, with the goofy comedy and action, and then Child of the Hunt is Spider-Man Noir.
Sometimes I let matches burn down to my fingertips just to feel something, anything. Oh.
It's not a bad change. I think it's quite a bit of an improvement. However, it's still jarring and makes me giggle at how extreme the shift is. A result of the tone shift is a much more respectful take on the teenagers. Their various problems aren't spun into, haha, teens are stupid, am I right? Like they are in Halloween Reign and Blooded. And they are instead used for drama, where the characters are aware of their problems and have anxiety about them that leads them to do other things to compensate while having emotional breakdowns. To paraphrase Spike, everyone is
hanging on by a thread.
And it's realistic, respectful, and true to the tone of the show. Well, mostly, but I'll get into the exceptions later. Also, it's not nearly as racist as Blooded. I know that viewers of my review of Blooded must be curious if it's as bad, and it's not. There are some cringy Romani stereotypes, but no worse than the show itself, some confused depictions of anti-Latino racism that are portrayed negatively, and a positive if sensationalistic depiction of Vodou spirituality. Either the author's issues are strictly with East Asian cultures, or someone at the publishing house actually read Blooded and got them to course correct. Further, the strange use of the obsolete but inoffensive Hebrew instead of Jewish makes me think that they were more ignorant than malicious. The book is set in Sunnydale and has mediations on the plight of teenage runaways, a la Dead Man's Party, and has a Monster of the Week plotline, riffing on Anne's evil capitalist demons preying on runaways, but instead tying it into a rich piece of real-world myth. The Wild Hunt of the Errol King, the Norse god Odin, or the pagan German figure Wotan, or the pagan English figure Herne, named for an old word for horn, as in hunting horn. The character in the book calls himself Hearn, so I'll go with that. But Odin and Wotan do get name dropped. The legend goes that the Earl King, Hearn, or Odin, or Wotan, is a monstrous warrior with antlers who leads a Fey hunting party, the Wild Hunt. They hunt down people walking lonely roads at night and other such unfortunate travelers. Their victims hear horses and dogs but don't see them, and if they don't seek shelter, it's it for them. To keep the Wild Hunt stocked with huntsmen, the Earl King seduces young boys with promises of his lusty daughter, showing them a good time.
My gentle boy, wilt thou with me go? My daughters all pretty pastimes know. My daughters nightly the gay revels keep. We'll dance and we'll sing and we'll rock thee to sleep. We'll dance and we'll sing and we'll rock thee to sleep.
If the boys agree, their souls leave their bodies, and their parents find them dead. It makes for decent fodder for a substitute for the evil capitalist demons, and a plot about monsters exploiting youth. The book starts off when Buffy slays a vampire, a run-of-the-mill action not notable in itself. It's not a master vampire, or a quirky cosplayer, just a random vampire. Except this particular non-notable vampire happens to have a mother who doesn't even know that her son was killed by a vampire in the first place, and thinks that he's a teenage runaway. She and Joyce organize a campaign to find him and let him know that he should come home. Joyce puts pressure on Buffy to help out, and gets angry when she goes patrolling, and ultimately slays the person they're looking for. And Buffy can't bear to tell Joyce that he is dead, keeping the secret at her own expense, as Joyce now considers her selfish, and retaining that offensive quality that led her to run away herself, and that now drives the two of them apart. All Buffy can do is suffer in silence, while Joyce comforts the boy's mother, fittingly enough named Anne. Oh, the angst! Meanwhile, Giles is suffering from PTSD as a result of Angelus murdering Jenny, but he devotes his energies into helping other people, like an elderly neighbor, police officer Jamie Anderson, whose own teenage son Brian ran away years ago. Jamie tries to deal with his pain on his own and runs a campaign to help educate high schoolers about teenage runaways. But he admits that he needs emotional help from others, and reaches out to Giles, in a rather nice dismissal of toxic masculine stoicism. Oh, the angst! The use of Jamie as a cop is mostly to help Giles be aware of things going on in Sunnydale, in a noir trope similar to Angel's friendship with Kate on Angel. However, it lacks the true noir genre, and doesn't use the trope as a means of criticizing the police as an institution, making it come off as a bit of unwelcome pro-cop propaganda. There is nothing that he adds to the book as a cop that couldn't also be handled by a social worker. That said, the fact that a cop can seek help for mental health is fairly subversive to the police culture, though I'm pretty sure that was a coincidence on the part of the authors. The theme of parents caring about missing runaways is contrasted with two teenage runaway characters who are sympathetic as they evade detection. Connie, spelled with an IE, and her boyfriend Bobby, the child of illegal immigrants. Her mother, Liz, almost catches up to them, but they run and vanish into the lonely Sunnydale streets. Oh, the angst! All of this tension reaches a head when a traveling acting troupe hosts a Renaissance fair. The whole Scooby Gang goes, and they end up having a great time. At least they do, until Angel observes a gimmick with an actor placed in a pillory, and his PTSD is triggered, because he was placed in a pillory himself for public drunkenness in his human days as Liam. And then he wanders around the fair, nostalgic for a time forever outside his grasp. Oh, the angst! A weird element of this is him remembering his father reading Hamlet and quoting, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Except Angel doesn't recognize it as Hamlet. He remembers his father saying one of the most quoted lines in Hamlet, but he just remembers that an Englishman wrote it. What? You're telling me Angel doesn't know Shakespeare's most famous play? Well, it's not as if he's a book nerd who sat around all day reading for the last century. Oh wait! Yeah, he is! Meanwhile, Giles sees Jamie break his pledge of sobriety by downing beers, and tries to reach out to him, only for Jamie to reject him in a fit of anger. Oh, the angst! In the midst of conversation, Jamie tells Giles about strange going-ons in town, unexplained bodies, and impish mischief. Some kind of animal has been chewing up cars and water pipes, and there have been cattle mutilations. He finds the Scoobies to tell them, leading to a wacky, disjointed conversation of misunderstandings, like an Abbott and Costello routine. Part of it involves a gay joke that is actually handled pretty well, where Buffy initially thinks that Giles is dating a woman named Jamie, and upon his clarifying that Jamie is a man, seamlessly transitions into the Scoobies being supportive of Giles coming out as gay. It's treated comedically, but it doesn't treat the subject as degrading or shocking. It's even handled better than the actual coming out scene in the canonical show.
That's great. I think Tara's a really great girl, Will.
Giles asserts that something is happening in Sunnydale, and Xander says, "Something wicked, this way comes." Now, Xander, let's not confuse Angel with these obscure pop culture references. Buffy sees an actor who looks too young for this troupe and assumes that he's a teenage runaway because, she knows the theme of the book. She's right, but she has no reason to be. She tries to reach out to him and learns that his name is Roland, but he pulls away from her. After the fair closes, she sneaks back into it to investigate and sees the other actors savagely beating him, so she jumps in to save him. The actors reveal that they're a troupe of witches and warlocks, one of whom being a creepy man threatening her with sex slavery. Yeesh. Fortunately, these are video game magic users who just throw elements at her, instead of doing anything creative like turning her into a rat that would actually be effective. So she fights them off and takes Roland to her place. He begs her not to contact any authorities or tell her mother, so she sneaks him into the basement. However, she returns in the morning to find that he's made of dirt and only animates at night. She tells Giles, who speculates that he's a golem, an animated clay man from Jewish mythology. Willow is totally unfamiliar with the concept and asks if he means Gollum from The Hobbit. While I speculated in my review of Blooded that the author seemed to think that Xander was Jewish and Willow wasn't, this error has been corrected in Child of the Hunt, albeit with the word Hebrew. There is a reference to her mother eating kosher and suggesting her father should have been a rabbi, which is, incidentally, more Jewish culture than we see in the actual show. However, it represents a glaring research failure that Willow, a well-read Jewish girl, would not know what a golem is. They are very popular figures. I stand by my entry of Jews in the list of cultures the authors do not understand. Despite meandering around the subject of golems for a bit, the book settles on the term homunculus, an alchemical construct. This is a lot closer to what Roland is than the golem. One wonders why they brought it up at all.
Oh, you're my little homunculus.
Buffy and Angel investigate the cattle mutilations at the edge of Sunnydale in the Los Viejos National Forest, in allusion to the real-world Los Padres National Forest. Los Viejos thematically means the old men, as are the wild huntsmen. While Buffy and Angel deal with sexual tension, a large group of dark fairies, small impish green demons, show up in the area and are quick to attack. Each one has sharp teeth and claws, capable of doing some damage, and their numbers allow them to overwhelm Buffy and Angel, like the like the compies from The Lost World Jurassic Park, which just came out the year before in 1997. I mean, the trope of a large number of weak enemies exists beyond the compies, but I think it's a little bit of a coincidence, don't you think? They're even colored the same. Before the dark fairies kill them, a hunting horn blows, calling them off, but only Angel can hear it. He also hears dogs, but doesn't see anything. Buffy notices a locket on the ground and takes it as she and Angel return to the library to nurse their wounds and build sexual tension. Oddly, Giles doesn't have the first crack at exposition this time. It comes from Angel, and not because of his vampiric connection to the occult, but from his experiences as Liam. Growing up in Ireland, he learned local superstitions about the fair folk, and, of course, in the Buffyverse, it would all be true. It's a fascinating bit of world building, exploring a character we don't see nearly enough of in canon. He connects the fairies to the phantom sound of the horn and hunting dogs. They muse on that and then address the locket. It has the name Connie on it, spelled with a Y. Even though the spelling is different, Giles connects it to the missing Connie with an IE. Buffy then becomes convinced that Connie with a Y is a runaway, just as she's convinced that Roland is a runaway for no reason other than runaways are the theme of the book, and she somehow knows it. Giles is polite to Angel and tells off Xander for being rude to him, but can't help but be triggered by his presence. It's a mature way to depict the lasting effects of trauma, even as it appropriately notes the distinction between Angel and Angelus. Buffy notices Giles' continued suffering and broods about it, and the conflict caused by her sexual tension with Angel. Oh, the angst! Jamie takes Giles to Connie with an IE's mother, Liz, and shows her the locket. Liz confirms that it belongs to Connie with an IE. Turns out, Bobby didn't know how to spell her name right because he barely knows English. What the detail attempts to do is highlight Bobby's language difficulties and how they create confusion among fluent English speakers. But it's framed like his presence creates tension because he's mentally disabled, not because of any anti-Latino racism. I barely speak Spanish, but if I had a thing for a Mexican person and wanted to give them a locket engraved with their name, I would, at the very least, learn how to spell it. There is a difference between barely speaking a country's dominant language and having a mental disability, but the authors problematically conflate the two. I actually wonder if he wasn't originally supposed to be a mentally disabled white kid and was later rewritten. I mean, Bobby is kind of a weird name for a Mexican immigrant. Not Roberto? Just a thought. Liz is portrayed as a bigot for thinking ill of Bobby, but she's framed as ableist more than racist. Her husband, Artie, calls her out on it, while simultaneously revealing himself as sexist. All of this is somewhat problematically framed as a product of their social class. However, which class that would be is unclear. When the scene begins, the family is framed as working class, living in a bad neighborhood where Giles needs to lock his car. But then they read like they're upper class, employing Bobby's mother as a maid. Later on, Liz is shown hanging out in a dingy bar, like she is working class. It's all very clumsily written. The anti-Asian sentiment of Blooded gives me pause, but I honestly think that the writers are trying to make an anti-bigotry statement here, just that they don't know how bigotry works well enough to actually depict it effectively. Joyce and Liz are actually friends, and Joyce reaches out to her and helps her get through her pain by relating to her own feelings about Buffy. Oh, the angst! A wild huntsman known as Shock recognizes Sunnydale as a place that he used to live, and remembers his human identity as Brian Anderson. He returns to his father, looking exactly the same as when he vanished, despite several years having passed since then, with stories of being abducted by the Fae. And Jamie recognizes that his friend Giles, with all the weird occult books, might be able to help. Giles consults with a German friend, serving a role similar to Kobo in Blooded, but without any associated racism this time, and determines that their enemy is the Errol King. Oz makes the connection to Odin because he's super into Norse mythology in this book, and Xander is able to summarize Odin because he reads Thor comics. There is an unfortunate reappearance of the Halloween Rain, good little children should focus on their schoolwork theme, when Willow criticizes Xander for not really studying mythology and wasting his time reading comic books, even though the example used showed that he did learn something about Norse mythology. Also, the author's attempt at comic book banter mixes up the competing comic book companies Marvel and DC by indicating that Thor, a Marvel character, is a member of the Justice League, a DC team, instead of Marvel's equivalent team, the Avengers. Can I add geeks to the list of cultures they don't understand?
The Avengers gotta get with the assembly.
The witches and warlocks attack Joyce to get Roland back, leading to her yelling at Buffy for withholding important information. Oh, the angst! Buffy and Angel go to retrieve Roland, but he insists that they leave, and they do when the Wild Hunt takes their attention. The Wild Hunt takes back Brian, and also kills babies and children in town. It's implied that their souls were stolen for the hunt, but it's unclear what good a baby would do as a huntsman. How would they even be seduced? My daughters have plenty of breast milk? Either way, it's a brutal toll that motivates the Scoobies to defeat the Errol King. Also, Giles unearths a reference to a Slayer named Lucy Hanover, who faced the Errol King. It seems like it's Buffy's destiny to slay him once and for all. The name drop of Lucy Hanover is an allusion to a promo video that aired before the series premiere, summarizing the Slayer mythology with a list of past Slayers. Most of them go the way of Jesse and are never mentioned again, even in non-canon material, and it's interesting that Lucy is brought back for this tie-in novel.
Virginia, 1866. The frequent and unexplained disappearance of local Civil War widows shocked an already grieving community. These disturbing events ended when Lucy Hanover set up camp in a nearby graveyard. 1897.
The Scoobies go after the Wild Hunt in a meandering fashion, where different groups approach the hunt from different angles, encountering different obstacles. It feels like an attempt to pad it out. I would prefer it be truncated, just have the unified group attack it all at once. Angel, Oz, and Cordelia get bogged down fighting dark fairies. Cordelia runs off to get slaying supplies, while Angel and Oz transform into monster forms. Due to fairy magic, Oz finds that he can shift halfway, having wolf strength, without the wild hostility. It's kind of an ass pull, but it allows him to contribute to the group to the same degree as Angel. Willow, Giles, and Xander are captured by the Wild Hunt and made to march as prisoners. They meet Brian and Connie, who is taken as well. While Brian holds on to his human identity, Connie surrenders to the Wild Hunt and takes a new identity as Treasure, an evil sexually dominant persona, which is an accurate Buffy motif, but not much is done with it, similar to the barely described transgender body possession scenes in Night of the Living rerun. The Errol King wants to lead them into battle with the actor troupe and presses the Scoobies to submit. Xander bluffs that he has a message for him from Lucy Hanover and will only give it to him if he releases them. The Errol King, baffled, points out that she's dead. Xander retorts that he talks to dead people all the time. True. They even have conversations with dead people. Unfortunately, Giles gives away that they're bluffing, but they get the interesting insight that the Errol King seems to have feelings for Lucy Hanover. The actor troupe realizes that the Wild Hunt is on their tail, and what they want is Roland, so they just leave him and run. The huntsmen pause their hunt to collect him. The Errol King reveals that Roland is his son, made with part of his spiritual essence and part of Lucy Hanover's soul, born into a homunculus body. So he's basically Steven Universe? Meanwhile, Buffy runs into a friendly centaur who is being chased by the Wild Hunt as game. He helpfully points her in their direction before running off. Buffy finds the bodies of dark fairies that Angel and Oz killed and cleverly rubs their gore over her body to keep the animals from sensing her approach. I like that nod to her intelligence. She discovers the prisoners and tries to help them escape, but the huntsmen see her and a fight breaks out. She ends up fighting a female hunter described as a fierce, bald woman with several piercings and a BDSM aesthetic, and, it's basically the female Cenobite from the Hellraiser series. The author has just stuck her in the story. In the middle of the fight, the Errol King hears Buffy's name and scoffs, "What kind of name is Buffy?" Buffy retorts, "What kind of name is Hearn?" Okay, that's honestly funny. Good job. Hearn interrupts with a threat to kill the Scoobies if Buffy doesn't submit. Buffy assesses the situation and determines that her surrender is the only thing that could save them, and agrees.
I submit! Submissively!
She swears an oath to always follow the Errol King's commands. Note, not Hearn's commands, the Errol King's. And she joins the hunt, while he releases her friends. It's very similar to Blooded depicting Buffy submitting to Chirayoju to save Willow and Angel, except that it's written much better. There is an actual sense of danger that would motivate her to surrender, and there is an actual material gain. As a Slayer, she can get into the idea of eternally hunting, and there's a predatory part of her personality that flares up, similar to what would be depicted in Season 5, Episode 1, Buffy vs. Dracula. It's not quite an evil, sexually dominant persona, but it's in the same vein, similar to her mildly dominant vampire form in Season 1, Episode 10, Nightmares. She rejects it as much as she can, but it's implied that if she stays with the Wild Hunt, she may turn into something like Treasure. She also refuses an offered meal of roasted centaur. Yeesh. That guy could talk and was friendly, and they eat him. Principal Flutie style. While the women of the Wild Hunt are given traditionally masculine roles as hunters, and are victimized as men typically are in their martial capacity, there is also an element of traditionally feminine sexual exploitation. The Earl King intends to force Treasure to marry Roland. Roland is also coerced, but the emphasis is on the female victimization, as with the Warlock's threat to Buffy. Once the Earl King acquires Buffy in the hunt, he intends to force her to marry Roland. Making Buffy essentially helpless in her sexual exploitation runs contrary to the feminist themes and is problematically similar to the Spike sexual assault scene in Season 6, Episode 19, Seeing Red. At least in Season 5, Episode 14, Crush, there's a sense of Buffy actively working the problem while chained up. Here, she's just a damsel in distress. After an angsty conversation with Joyce, Cordelia rejoins the Scoobies and gives them weapons, and they attack the Wild Hunt in full force. Giles does a voodoo prayer to weaken them. One might wonder, why? It's not set up at all. The German friend isn't a voodoo priestess. There's nothing in the Earl King lore to suggest a connection. It's just another way to do a prayer after the prayer to God in Halloween Rain and the prayer to Amaterasu in Blooded. What haven't we done yet? Voodoo? Okay. What's the barest research we can do on that? For what it's worth, it's portrayed positively, if a bit too much like a European witch's magic spell. It turns out that holy water is super effective on spectral dogs. They kill bad guys left and right, all of them releasing black mist from their mouths as they die, as if returning to their goodly original forms in death. The Earl King joins the fight in the silliest way possible, bowing his head and goring Angel with his antlers. Like it's written as horrific, but it's just a silly image. I don't think those antlers are actually supposed to be used. It's just fashion. In some versions, he's just wearing a deer pelt. For him to actually run at people like a deer is absurd. Roland turns on his father, and the Earl King orders Buffy to kill him. She is magically compelled to obey, however, she is able to resist out of sheer force of will. Yeah, I know some Gesh are broken by managing to make the thing they're meant to prohibit happen somehow, but just going against it when you really don't want to do what it compels you to do feels like breaking the rules. Of course you don't want to do it. That's why you're cursed to do it. At least in Season 1, Episode 12, Prophecy Girl and Buffy vs. Dracula, there is a sense of something mystical happening to change things. When the Earl King questions it, Buffy says she's not like other girls. Similar to the film callback in Blooded, but now in a way that goes against the original message of respecting all girls. Now we're supposed to accept Buffy as superior because she's the Slayer.
Just because you're better than us doesn't mean you can be all superior.
Roland attacks his father. The Earl King gores Roland, but he uses his magic homunculus strength to nail him with a battle axe as his body falls apart. In doing so, he absorbs his father's energy and takes his position as Earl King, now an incorporeal shadow being without a body. The remaining huntsmen, 3 people too transformed by demonic corruption to recognize, and Treasure, hail their new king. In his capacity as Earl King, Roland releases Buffy from his service. Buffy urges him to disband the Wild Hunt entirely, but he can't. He is as much a prisoner to the duty as Buffy was. But maybe he can make it less vicious. Maybe only hunt vampires, for as long as his mind can endure. But he warns her not to go looking for him again. He may well be transformed into an evil, sexually dominant persona by then. With that, he leads the huntsman into the Fey world, an alternate dimension, to rest before the next hunt. Buffy notably doesn't try to rescue Treasure. She notes that Connie doesn't have a good home life, that her parents are probably abusive, and that she's already transformed into Treasure, a Fey-like being with glowing eyes. Treasure will have a good life that she can appreciate in her evil, sexually dominant persona, and that's that. Resolving the character in a way similar to the Skinwalker in Coyote Moon, wandering off to live as a coyote. Roland is positioned as a teenage runaway with an abusive father. He runs away, gets exploited by an evil acting troupe,
The theater!
And returns home. He can't stand the abuse and kills his father but turns into him, like he's destined to perpetuate the cycle of abuse. He'll resist, but it's inevitable. It seems to be saying that abused people have no hope, so society might as well dispose of them. While the Scoobies should be grateful that they have parents that the framing deems non-abusive, because they can always go home and move on. This is not a good message, and goes against the themes of the show.
Angel Investigations, we help the hopeless.
There are a series of dramatic interludes about the Scoobies' parents wondering where their children are. Xander's parents think that he's a wild partier. Cordelia's parents are classist and think that the less wealthy kids are corrupting their daughter into delinquency. Willow's father, Ira, muses on how to be a good parent without citing any Jewish religious precedent, and yet gets his wife, Sheila, to comment that he should have been a rabbi. Whatever. And Joyce reflects on the horror of her daughter risking her life every night. Oh, the angst. The Scoobies make a series of excuses designed to make their parents worry the least. In the final scene, Buffy shows up at Joyce's assembly to promote awareness of teenage runaways, along with Jamie and Brian, making no attempt to explain the obvious age gap. Liz is also there, praying her daughter will return, while Buffy knows that she never will. Oh, the angst. Joyce holds Buffy's hand and earnestly tells her how happy she is that Buffy is in her life. Buffy answers that she feels the same way about her. The book concludes on this bittersweet image, totally forgetting to resolve what happened to Bobby. Yeah, you remember Bobby? The book doesn't. Oh well, that's how it happens. Overall, this is a pretty good book, easily my favorite so far. It feels like the authors took elements from all the preceding books, even those not theirs, and recomposed them in a much better execution. Even though the book does lean into the gratuitous angst a little too strongly, I appreciate that it has a more respectful take on teenage drama. Obviously, the racism was the worst part of Blooded, and that's been taken out, or at least downplayed, for Child of the Hunt, which feels like a progressive work written by very white authors who didn't do a lot of research. Not perfect by any means, but not alarmingly awful either. Part of the problemacy is the starting assumption that a police officer is a good guy. Jamie's profession is not at all at odds with the missions of Watchers and Slayers. There is no nuance in the depiction of what a cop is versus what a cop should be, as there is with, say, Kate. Though canonical depictions of the police aren't perfect, there is at least a nod to internal problems in the police, like racism, brutality, and cops being forgiving of bad behavior because of the allure of fascism. Without this nuance, Child of the Hunt could accurately be described as copaganda. Very white progressivism only goes so far. There is still an element of parental condescension, as with the joke about Xander not knowing about Odin through societally approved means. The authors don't care that comic book fans might learn something through comics. They only care that they don't learn through studying a textbook for school. The screw-up with thinking that Thor is a member of the Justice League reveals an utter contempt for the subject matter. They don't bother to verify that the pop culture reference makes sense. They just wanted to shame Xander for not being a good student. This basic position of condescension makes for a problematic standpoint for addressing the serious issue of teenage runaways and their parents. The portrayal of abuse is flawed, damning abuse victims to becoming perpetrators of abuse themselves to be dismissed as people worth caring about. It problematically associates abuse with social classes other than the middle one, and it leaves no room to contemplate if the Scoobies themselves might be abused by their parents. The analysis of Joyce is controversial, but a lot of fans interpret her as being abusive in her treatment of Buffy, coming out as a Slayer. Buffy's father is ultimately depicted as an abusive deadbeat dad in Season 6 in the comics. Sheila Rosenberg seems abusive in her emotionally distant handling of Willow. As for Xander's parents, they come off as both belligerent and emotionally abusive. Season 4 Episode 22 Restless and Season 6 Episode 16 Hell's Bells eventually imply his father is physically abusive too. Maybe abuse should be framed less as an immutable state of damned people, and more as a problematic pattern of behavior that anyone can be subject to and anyone can improve from if they can recognize it and put in the effort to change. After all, what's Buffy without a little redemption? Next time, we're picking on the druids again with a new author in Return to Chaos.
The father shall drink, disperse